In the last segment, I had isolated an intermittent fuel pump uh, failure uh, to broken wires in the epoxy on the through connector in the pump flange itself. This was on a 2006 Multistrada. So this O-ringed connector slips through the opening in the flange and then is held in place by an O-ring. And I dug out the epoxy out of the connector here, and there were actually two wires that were broken, both of these black wires. One is the ground for the fuel pump itself, and the other one is a sense lead for the fuel level sensor. And I've repaired the wires, soldered them back in place, and I've been freezing this overnight. So now I'm just going to do another continuity check to ensure that my solder joints are good and that I have good connection under the fail conditions after freezing this all night. So let's see here. Okay, so I got 0.2 ohms, and I cannot pull that wire out of its solder joint. I also inspected for a cold solder joint, and all the solder joints now look really good. So I'm going to go ahead and epoxy this now. We'll just check that other black wire to the fuel level sensor. Right, okay, and that's looking very good. And just to be thorough, I'm going to go through and check them all. So the two wires that were broken are now looking very solid. And I'll just check the two that I did not tamper with. Good. Hot lead to the fuel pump. I felt that move a little bit. No, that feels good too, solid. Alright, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to epoxy this connector back up. I'm just going to use JB weld, and then what I'm going to do is put a layer, just kind of a thin layer of Kreem, a tank liner, which is essentially liquid PVC. I'm going to put a thin layer of Kreem over the surface of the JB weld, because in my experience there's very few epoxies that'll stand up to fuel over time, particularly if it's got a lot of ethanol in it, and this connector is immersed in the fuel. So this epoxy that's put in here is constantly exposed to fuel in the tank. So I'm going to stabilize the wires with JB weld, which in my experience JB weld softens over time when exposed to gas. So then I'm going to put a little layer of Kreem over the top of that to protect the JB weld from the gas. Kreem seems to really stand up to gasoline over time, much better than JB weld anyway. So that's the approach, and I'm going to get started mixing up the JB weld. And then after I do, mosquito in my coffee here. After after the JB weld sets up, I'm going to put it back in the freeze overnight again, and then in the morning, tomorrow morning, I will do another continuity check just to make sure nothing's changed before I install this harness back into the fuel pump flange and put it back in the gas tank. I've decided to put the harness back in the flange before I JB weld it, and or epoxy up that connector, because the flange will provide a stable platform to actually put the epoxy into the connector, and then I'll just put the whole flange, I'll put the whole assembly in the freezer. Well, I can see the Crush is starting out with their playlist this morning, and they play about 10 songs over and over and over again, all day long, same 10 songs. It's a shame. This radio station I started watching 20 years ago when it was first founded. It was a great local radio station. Now it's a piece of shit. I got to turn that off. Okay, so I popped the connector back into the flange. There is an O-ring. Excuse me. There's an O-ring that seals that in the flange, and I lubricated that up with a little dielectric grease. And there is a snap ring that holds that connector in place on the flange. Perfect. Okay, so now I will epoxy that connector. The flange will provide a nice stable platform to allow me to pack that. This JB weld flows pretty nicely while it's warm. I'm using Quickset, and it does start the hardening process fairly quickly. So you want it to flow down and then be able to clean it up a little bit. So you need to work kind of quickly with the Quickset. We'll let that set up, and then put just a little bit of a surface layer of Kreem on it to seal it, the tank liner Kreem, to seal that and to protect that epoxy from protect the JB weld. The JB weld is that epoxy is set up, so I'm going to go ahead and coat the top of that with some Kreem fuel tank liner, just to add a little additional protection on that on the JB weld against the attack of the fuel. I believe this is sort of liquid PVC. I've gotten away from using it on the line fuel tanks. I use Pour 15 now, which I think is a superior product. The Kreem is already skinning over. That stuff sets up fast. So once that hardens, I'll check the integrity of it, make sure I can't peel it off, and then this goes in the freezer overnight Tomorrow morning I'll check the continuity across the connector again through the flange. If all is good, I'll install it in the fuel tank and we'll call it a done job. Going to lubricate this surface where the gasket or the O-ring seals. So this is a rubber gasket, thick gasket. It's not really an O-ring, it's a square O-ring, if you will. So there's a front on these. And there it is. Boy, you can tell this gas tank's warped. These flange holes are not lining up real great. And these standoffs that mount the cover to the pump, this one has to remain out when removing the tank and installing the tank because it interferes with the frame. So you can't get the tank out without removing that. Well, there's one fuel pump, intermittent fuel pump failure repaired and reinstalled. And now we'll just adjust the valves and do a service on the bike and she'll be ready to go.